Young Jim Doherty was willing to risk everything to sell his cattle. Trail of the Crawling Dead by Edward Felton, published in the West in January 1966. Jim Doherty sensed trouble when he saw the cloud of dust and then the 20 horsemen riding toward him and Harry Jeffries, his trail boss. It was early in the morning of June 24, 1866. Young Doherty and Jeffries were driving a herd north on the new and untried cattle trail that led from Texas to Sedalia, Missouri. He and Jeffries were well ahead of the main herd of over 1,000 longhorns. The two had 50 steers and were trying to locate the road to take them across the short Arkansas stretch of the trail. At first, Jim Doherty believed that the oncoming horsemen were irate farmers protesting the presence of Texas cattle carrying the ticks that spread the dread Spanish fever among cattle. But as the horsemen got closer, Jim knew these men were not irate farmers. They were trail outlaws who infested the new cattle trail. They caught Jim and Jeffries miles from the main herd without the protection of the rifles and 6 guns of the cowboys with the herd. The leader of the outlaws was a giant man with a heavy beard and the small eyes of a snake. These outlaws were more than rustlers. They would demand large sums of money to permit the herd to pass, and when this was paid, they would grab the herd. That is, they would if they could catch a small herd without too much protection, which was the case with Doherty and Jeffries. Money was one thing. Young Doherty had little of until he could get his herd to Sedalia, where he hoped to sell the cattle. But even if he had money, he knew paying the ransom would not stop the trail outlaws from taking his cattle. There was only one thing to do: make a break for it in the hope that of getting back to the main herd where the rustlers wouldn't dare to attack. It was a good idea, but the bearded leader read young Doherty's thoughts, and as he and Jeffrey swung their horses around to make the break, the bearded leader gave quick orders to his men, and they had Doherty and Jeffries surrounded. Other outlaws were shooting and yelling to stampede the cattle, while the leader and 10 men yanked Doherty and Jeffries from their horses, gun-whipped them, and then tied them to trees with ropes. They were beaten with long sticks. The outlaws lashed them until blood covered their backs. Doherty and Jeffries finally sank slowly into unconsciousness. Then the leader ordered them to cut down, and the two slumped to the ground, bleeding and groaning. As the outlaw pack rode away, the bearded leader said, "All right, you yellow coyotes, start crawling forward because you haven't got any horses." The expression of the outlaw leader caused the trail to be known as the Trail of the Crawling Dead, as several of his victims had died as they crawled forward. But young Doherty had no intention of crawling or creeping to his death. Consciousness had returned. He struggled to his feet and stumbled to the spring, where he filled his sombrero with fresh, cool water and then struggled back to Jeffries, who was still out cold. The fresh water on his back and face brought consciousness. 15 minutes later, the two were able to stand up, and Doherty cursed himself for having pushed so far in front of the main herd in his mad rush to get to Sedalia ahead of the other cowmen. Yet impatience was a part of the Doherty makeup. His father had staked out a spread in Colorado on the Colorado River basin near the present town of Sweetwater before the Civil War. Jim was the only son, and he worshipped his father, who would feed or fight any man depending on what the man might be looking for. Old Jim Doherty was killed in the Battle of the Wilderness fighting for Lee and the South. The only inheritance young Jim got was the spread, which was practically abandoned during the war, and $900 in a Dallas bank. Young Jim had enlisted in an Alabama regiment and came through the war unscathed. After Appomattox, he rode his cavalry horse back to Texas, wondering, like all the other ex-Confederates, what was coming next. His mother had died, the ranch was in weeds, and the buildings had partly fallen down. And by joining the Confederacy, Texas had gone broke. Cattle had been its one important export, but its beef markets had been the had been the adjoining South, and now that the South was in hopeless bankruptcy, there was no money to pay for the beef. New and booming markets were to the north, where cattle could be shipped east. Cattle had multiplied in Texas during the war. More than 3 million were running loose with no owners. But getting the cattle to the northern markets was the problem. Then came the circulars from the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad, advertising Sedalia, Missouri as the ideal shipping point for Texas cattle to the east and the best ready market for any Texas cattle. Young Jim Doherty saw his great opportunity with the aid of Harry Jeffries, an experienced cattleman. Jim rounded up 1,200 wild longhorns. He drew the $900 from the bank and hired a corps of adventurous young ex-Confederate soldiers to help him drive the herd north to Sedalia. After paying these men and buying chuck for the long trip and other necessary supplies, Jim had less than $100 in gold left. Jim Doherty experienced no trouble so long as the herd was still on home ground. But after he crossed Red River at Rock Bluffs into Indian Territory, trouble started boiling like chili in the bean pot. He found himself in the Cherokee Nation, the sovereign republic of Indians who could read, talk, and haggle like white men. A platoon of their militia, though it was called something else, swooped down to demand in elegant English that Jim pay a tax of $2 per head on his stock, $2,400 in all. The Cherokees seemed to have little sympathy for Jim's financial problems. After some coldly courteous conversation, these Indians decided to let Jim off with a fine payable in stock flesh for his unauthorized crossing of their land. The penalty, 30 of his finest steers, 4 of his best horses. From what the other cowmen had previously told him, Jim knew that he'd have to face this tribe levy almost every 50 miles, so he shifted his course east toward the Arkansas range country. He reached Fort Smith, Arkansas, a western town and a wild one, even if it lay within the boundaries of the southern state. At Fort Smith, he was warned that farmers and stockmen along the route were up in arms against the invasion of Texas cattle. They were wrathful because of the longhorns carried ticks that infected their cattle with a disease from which the Texas stock had developed an immunity. Other Texans he met in the Arkansas town also cautioned Jim against the packs of trail outlaws who had sprung up along the Sedalia Trail. Many of these thieving killers had been guerrilla bushwhackers disowned by the armies of both the North and South during the Civil War. They robbed anybody they could lay hands on. They had contraband markets where they sold cattle snatched during their raids. Many of Jim's countrymen, seeing his youth, advised him to sell his herd for whatever he could get in Fort Smith, then turn back to Texas. But Jim didn't listen to the warnings. He and Jeffries headed the herd north to connect with the trail to Sedalia, which was in the northern part of the Indian Territory. The herd had just left the Arkansas stretch when young Jim allowed his impatience to get the better of his judgment, and he rode far ahead of the main herd with the 50 longhorns. That's when he ran into the trail outlaws. It took him and Jeffries some time to get their strength back from the bloody beating given to them by the outlaws. When they did, they looked around for their horses. The outlaws had taken the mounts, but presently they heard the hoofbeats of horses, and Jake Haynes and Johnny Bates, 2 of Doherty's cowpunchers, rode up ahead of the herd. They whistled in amazement when they saw the bloody backs of Doherty and Jeffries and heard what had happened to them. As soon as the chuck wagon drove up, the backs were treated with salt. Young Doherty took a heavy drink of whiskey and announced that he and Jeffries and Jake Haynes were riding out after the outlaws to get the herd back. Jeffries, old and experienced, protested that the 3 would hardly be a match against the outlaws and that it would be wiser to forget the 50 head and drive on to Sedalia. The arguments didn't move young Doherty. He and Jeffries and Haynes rode to the east to pick up the trail of the outlaws and the stolen cattle. Johnny Bates the assistant trail boss, was left in charge of the main herd with instructions to head for Sedalia. The three would join the herd later. "If we live through our meeting with the outlaws," Jeffrey said, "we'll join you." The three picked up the trail of the outlaws 5 miles from the spot where the cattle had been stampeded. Horse hoof marks showed where the outlaws had circled the longhorns and gotten them under control. Horse and cattle prints indicated that the stolen herd was being driven east toward the remote section of the Ozark Mountains. Jeffries, who's been over this country before, said that this that this area was full of isolated deep valleys where stock could be hidden before being moved to the contraband markets. Grimly, the three men followed the obvious trail, obvious because trail outlaws didn't bother to be careful. They never expected their victims to chase them for a showdown. High noon on the following day, from a hilltop, the pursuers looked down on a valley filled with corrals and rough cabins. They counted 50 cattle, which Jim Doherty recognized as his own, and they saw the trail outlaws and heard them talking. The whole gang was drunk on Ozark Shine, and the lookouts posted at the valley's entrance were also stewed. The three dismounted. For some time their eyes took in the lay of the land. Then Jim Doherty began studying the cattle. Used to the wide spaces, the longhorns were restless and fidgety from being cramped in this narrow valley. The outlaws hadn't taken the precaution of driving them into corrals before going off on that jolly rampage of booze. Carelessness was the occupational failing of these rustlers. The cattle were beginning to mill from the commotion staged by the drunks. Their tails were twitching, a sure sign of an impending stampede. The thieves' horses stood hobbled a far pace away. Then Jim Doherty, raised among cattle, saw how he could use the animals against themselves. On hands and knees, inching along, Jim moved toward the herd, pulling up clumps of dry grass from under his belly. The carousing outlaws were paying no attention to anything but their jugs. Jim now was on the edge of the herd. He glanced backward over his shoulder. On the hill, Haynes and Jeffries were holding the horses by their bridle reins. Jim lit a handful of dry grass and tossed the burning stuff under 3 of the most restless steers. The longhorns jumped in the air, bawling and bellowing. The grass around them began breaking into little ribbons of flame. Cattle started snorting and pawing. Their tails became pointed and rigid, the cow reflexes before the stampede. Jim Doherty ran toward his comrade. He jumped on his horse as the two mounted theirs and rode toward the cattle, Spencer rifles barking and spewing. Skillfully, the three turned the stampede toward the drunken trail outlaws. Before these thieves knew what had happened, an avalanche of hoofs had descended upon them. High above the billowing clouds of the smoke from the burning grass, Jim heard anguished shrieks from the crack of human bone. Trail outlaws were ground to shreds, along with the jugs that they had hoisted. Shacks and corrals were smashed to splinters. Past the wrecked camp, the terrified cattle charged on. Jeffries and Haynes followed them on horseback, waiting for the stampede to wear itself out. The fire halted at the creek where Jim had guessed that it would. Jim, riding slowly behind his partners, was looking for one certain trail outlaw, the one who'd ordered them bound and whipped. Jim saw the big fellow running like mad to the right of the plunging herd. He jumped from the saddle and landed on top of the pack's leader. Cowman and cow, they struggled. The 6-foot outlaw got to his feet first. He saw who his assailant was, and bellowing like one of the maddened steer, he hurled himself at Jim, also 6 feet, and also now on his feet. The youth ducked the Lobo's charge, then whirled around to deliver him a heavy blow in the belly. The bearded leader doubled over, coughing and cursing. Jim followed that by landing a crashing blow on his chin, and the thief struggled forward, his clenched fist flailing in the air. By force of habit, the outlaw's hand darted to his waist, but his gun was gone, crushed too, in the stampede after which he had unbuckled it during the moonshine spree. 2 more right and left punches sent the leader sprawling. He groaned loudly and began trying to crawl away from the only victim who had ever come after him. Doherty jerked him to his feet. The bearded outlaw went down for the last time from a swift blow on the side of the head. He was unconscious when Jim Doherty turned and swung on his horse. That pack of trail outlaws had committed its last holdup on the Sedalia Trail, and as it turned out, Jim Doherty would be the last man to attempt to drive up its forbidding course. Jim overtook Harry Jeffries and Jake Haynes. The three managed to slow down the stampede of those terrified longhorns, then drove them back to the outfit where they were cut into the main herd. As a celebration, Jim ordered one of the fattest steers barbecued, and the boys in the outfit feasted. But as they stuffed themselves and swapped Wendy's, he was even then seeing ahead some future phase of the cattle industry. Missouri's Grangers, he had heard, were petitioning the state government in Jefferson City to close the Sedalia Trail. They had had enough of Texas ticks and Texas cattle. Even without that kind of pressure from politicians' constituents, this trail had all sorts of disadvantages. The outlaws were too thick and the grass too thin. The thickets along the trail bred billions of insects which descended in swarms on the longhorns. These poor creatures spent so much energy fighting off the pests that they often looked like gaunt walking skeletons when they were offered to the cattle buyers in Sedalia. Up in Kansas, a railroad had extended its line to Abilene at the request of a man named McCoy. This McCoy was in Texas trying to interest the cattlemen in driving their herds north. There was a natural trail used for centuries by the Indians, also by Captain French and other early explorers. It ran north through the Indian Territory, where there was an abundance of grass. In the early days, it was known as Abilene Cattle and Stage Road, but in later years it became known as the Chisholm Trail. Just what part old Jesse Chisholm had in naming the trail is a moot question. The Chisholm Trail ran from the Wichita Mountain to the town of Wichita in Kansas. It was believed that a poem about this famous Abilene cattle trail was responsible for it being called the Chisholm Trail, as the poem or unknown poet gave it that name. Jim Doherty's route to Sedalia lay northwest, following his set to with the trail drivers. But he'd been hearing of a new cattle market which had been opened in Fort Scott, nor far from the Missouri boundary. Once again he decided to take a gamble, so he turned the herd due north toward Fort Scott. No more trouble overtook him on the finish of that journey. Fort Scott rolled out the red carpet for him when his herd hit the place. Jim sold his cattle to the bustling stock-buying firm of Myers and Brown for $9 a head. The price was less than what he might have gotten in Sedalia, but it meant an $8,000 profit. It was $8,000 that became the basis for the Doherty Cattle Kingdom, one of the largest in Texas. 2 years after his battle with the Lobos, the Abilene Cattle and Stage Road became the Great Northern Passageway of the Longhorns. Up its celebrated course went Jim Doherty and the big Doherty herds. 7 trips he made in 7 years, selling his cattle in Newton, Abilene, and Ellsworth. He kept facing plenty of stampedes, but to this day in Texas, the name of Jim Doherty stands out for one thing. He was the only Western cattleman who ever trapped rustlers by his stampede.